All right, we are live here. A little late. I tried to get the stream up going earlier and it wouldn't go live. I was probably having problems with my OBS here. You can probably see how long I've been going for there. But let me make sure my audio is working here and we will get started here. So let me hit this. That sounds good there. And then let me hit play and make sure the audio from Studio One is feeding into the live stream here. I can't take anymore. Baby, I'm all the way yours. I'm holding it in. I'm holding it out for you. Just give me the word. I can't take anymore. Baby, I'm all the way yours. I'm holding it in. I'm holding it out for you. Just give me the word. I can't take anymore. That sounds good. All right. It sounds like we have audio here. So today we are going over my 3-step framework for mixing drums. Let me play you one more time here, the finished mix, so you can hear how our drums are sitting inside the mix here, and then I'm going to solo up the drums. If you stick with me here to the end of the stream, I do have a cool bonus for you guys. It is launch day for my new course here. I'm going to be launching all week. If you're on my email list, you're going to be getting emails with cool bonuses and cool tips and tricks about the course here. If you're sticking with me to the end here, I do have a bonus for you in the link below, and it is a bonus if you join the course today on the stream. You are going to get access to a one-time exclusive bonus here. But let me hit play here. You can hear how our track is sounding. Then I'm going to solo up the drums, and you can hear how our drums are sounding inside the mix. We're going to break down a little bit of the routing first before we dive into the 3-step framework for mixing drums. So here's our finished mix here, and then I will solo up the drums, and you can hear what they sound like here. I can't take anymore. Baby, I'm all the way yours. I'm holding it in. I'm holding it out for you. Just give me the word. I can't take anymore. Baby, I'm all the way yours. You can hear our finished drum mix there. Let's jump over and talk about the routing here, sending into our mix bus, just so you see what our drums are sending into before we dive into the processing on the individual channels here. We have 2 kick tracks, a kick in and a kick out. Those are sending into the kick level here, so a lot of sub buses that send into the drum bus here. Then we have a snare top, snare bottom. Those are sending into the snare level. Then we have 4 toms, 3 rack toms, and a floor tom. Those are sending into the tom bus here. And then I have overheads, rooms, and the Bricasti close, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Just a room emulation there on the end to give our drums some extra depth, some extra bigness here. All of these, so the sub buses here, and then our overheads and rooms on the end are sending into the drum bus. Our drum bus is here. There is nothing on the drum bus, no drum bus processing here today. Then our drum bus is sending into my mix A, which is my pseudo mix bus that sends into my actual mix bus here. On mix A here, just a couple plugins we'll go over before we dive into the drums here. First thing at the top of my my mix bus here is the console shaper. These 3 plugins here come in stock on my mixing template, and I never touch them. I mix into them for every track here. So I literally just pull this open, no noise, no crosstalk, and the drive is on, but dialed all the way back to 0 dB here. I'm not pushing that hard into this. I just want to get some of that console vibe. It gives the mix a little bit of extra depth and helps it feel a little less digital. Rolls off some of that digititis you get, that flatness that you get from mixing inside a digital system or a DAW like this. Next plugin here on the mix bus is my mix bus compressor. Again, this is something that comes in stock on my mixing template, and I never touch this. So attack is the slowest attack. We want to make sure we're not squashing any of the transients coming out of our mix here. Release is as fast as possible on this unit, so it lets go and it moves in time with our track here. Ratio is as gentle as possible, so we're using the 2-to-1 ratio. Again, we don't want to go too aggressive because we're affecting the entire track here. Threshold is at -1.6, something I never touch here, as well as the makeup gain, doing a dB of makeup. I'm going to hit play here so you can see what we're doing on the entire mix. It's generally about a dB to 2 dB of compression on the entire mix. That's why that dB of makeup gain is there. The nice thing about this SSL style bus compressor is that in addition to doing what a mix bus compressor does and gluing the mix together, it also gives some extra fatness and some extra weight in the bottom end. I really love what it does for the kick drum especially, but the kick drum and bass guitar as well. That's the mix bus compressor. Last thing on the mix bus here is the soft tube tape machine. And I pretty much run this at its default settings here. It's one click up from the default setting here. So we're up at 5.1 on the amount. I run it on the B type. To me, the B type gives some extra low end. It's like a bump in the bottom end. A type is the most balanced across the board. B is an extra bump in the bottom end, and C to me feels like a bump in the top end. So I like to use B for that extra bump in the bottom end. It helps with the kick and bass relationship, but especially when mixing drums, it gives you that extra weight that you need on your kick drum for it to feel big and for it to feel powerful. And then tape speed here is at 30 IPS. Anywhere else I use this tape machine inside the mix, I'm usually at 15 IPS, but on the master bus here, on the mix bus, I'm going to be up at 30 IPS here. Not pushing too hard into this, but let me show you what it does for the bottom end. So pay attention to our kick drum here. You can see we're sitting about between the 7 and the 5 here on the VU meter, so not pushing too hard into it, even though it is the entire mix pushing into the tape machine, but it gives that extra low end bump and that extra weight in the low end. It also adds some depth to the mix because it is some analog vibe from a tape machine. So the console shaper and the tape machine in combination help to give the mix some extra depth there. That's our mix bus processing. Last thing here on the mix bus is just a limiter. So the mix A sends into the mix bus here, and there's just a limiter on the mix bus. It's a 6 dB boost running into a -1 ceiling there. That's just to set our mix up to commercial level. I like to mix with a little bit of mastering on the master bus there. Now let's jump over to our drums here and start getting into our 3-step framework for mixing live drums here. We're going to look at 2 tracks specifically. We're going to look at our kick drum and we're going to look at our snare drum, and we're going to go through how this 3-step framework applies to both of these tracks here. Let's start with our kick drum here. So I'm going to play you the kick drum and I'm going to A/B the plugins we have here on our kick drum. So we'll start without it, and then I'm going to kick these plugins in. You can hear where our kick drum ends up after the processing. So you can hear without the processing there on our kick drum, it's a little loose sounding. We kick in our EQ, our compression, and our other EQ here. It tightens up our kick drum, gives it a ton of low end power here, while also emphasizing the attack and the click that we're getting on the top end here. Listen one more time, without and then with on our kick drum here. So what is step one in our three-step framework? Step one is EQ. If we're looking at our plugins here, you can probably imagine or guess what our three steps are. My three-step framework when I'm mixing drums that I always follow, it's the process that's running in my head, is EQ, compression, and EQ, especially for the kick drum and especially for the snare drum. But even when I'm mixing toms, overheads, and rooms, that's what's going on in my head. EQ, compression, and EQ. And some tracks don't need compression. Some tracks don't need that extra EQ. Sometimes it ends up being just EQ, but those are the three steps that I'm going through in my head. You kind of go through EQ, then does it need compression? If not, then we're done. If it needs compression, maybe it needs some extra EQ afterwards as well. All right. We'll had to step out there for a moment. But all right, jumping into step one here for mixing kick drum. We're going to look at our first EQ. I do have a little bit of limiting going on the front end here. Just holding our kick drum in place. You can see there's a couple peaks and a couple spikes here throughout our kick drum. Limiters just tucking those down so we end up with a more consistent kick drum before we dive into our processing here. So step one here for mixing kick drum or for mixing drums in the framework is EQ, and more specifically, getting rid of what we don't need on the drum here. So if we're pulling back these three things here, starting with a high pass filter, I'm always starting with a high pass filter. And sometimes, it can seem dangerous, especially with something like kick drum, right? You don't want to ruin your low end on the kick drum because that is what is most important. But our high pass filter helps to focus the low end and tighten the low end. So take a listen here. Step one in our drum mixing framework is getting rid of what we don't need. So we're rolling in our high pass filter here and getting rid of some of the sub area, but don't worry, we're going to get it back later and it's going to be more consistent and more focused. So take a listen to what this high pass filter does for our kick drum. We lose some of the sub area, but that is okay. We're focusing the kick drum on the fundamental area, which is sitting right here around the 70 and 80 hertz, and it tightens up our kick drum sound overall, so it doesn't feel so loose and so ringy sounding. Now, there is still a little bit of resonance left here around the 90 hertz area. It's just something that was ringing inside the kick drum. Sometimes you'll have some ringing with your kick drums here. So a little cut here, and you can see our Q is all the way up because we don't want to affect the surrounding low end on our kick drum. So take a listen without, and then I'll kick this cut in, and I'll also boost it up so you can hear the resonance I'm talking about. Just tucking out that resonance there so it's not something that's ringing throughout our low end. It didn't seem to be in key with the song or with the kick drum, so just ducking it down so it doesn't get exaggerated by the compression or the EQ we have down the line. The other thing we're getting rid of here, you can see it's pretty simple EQ on our first step here, just trimming out the things we don't need on our instrument here, so specifically our kick drum here. There was a little bit of ringing that seemed to be coming from our snare drum. So when the drummer hit the snare drum, we had a little bit of resonance or ring that bled into our kick mics here. So take a listen without, and then I'll kick it in and boost it up so you can kind of hear what I'm talking about. Just a little bit of ringing there coming up when our drummer hits the snare drum. That was kind of nasty sounding, and I didn't want it to get exaggerated by our compression there. So just ducking it out. This is a little bit more aggressive than our earlier one. Here we're trying to be safe so we don't affect our low end too much. Here we can pull this out without need to worry about affecting the rest of our kick drum there. And again, cues all the way up as narrow as possible. That is step number one. Step number one is getting rid of what you don't need on your track. So with drums here, looking at specifically the kick drum, getting rid of some extra sub area that we don't need, and pulling out some ringing that we don't need coming through on our drums. Moving on to step two here is compression. The compression we're going to use here is to tighten up our drum and emphasize the attack. So step one is getting rid of what we don't need with EQ. Step two is using compression to tighten up the drum and emphasize the attack. So our settings here on the compressor, we're going 3-to-1 on the ratio, so not going too aggressive, but not going too gentle. It needs to be high enough that we can get some good attack coming from our compressor. If it's too gentle, it'll just be evening things out. It won't be giving us some attack. Now our attack here is set at 30 milliseconds, so it's a medium, slower attack. Reason being is we don't want to squash the initial transient of the drum. If our attack is too fast, we're going to cut off that initial spike and that initial attack of the drum, and we won't get that nice click that we're looking for. All we'll get is the back end tone from our kick drum. We need to get that initial transient and that initial spike. And by slowing down our attack, we make sure we get that spike, and then our compressor starts working. That's how we emphasize that. The release here is set to be in time with the song, but this is my starting point for this compressor, is usually 120 milliseconds. Sometimes I'll pull it faster. It depends on the song. This is something you'll have to tweak for each song so it moves in time with your kick drum. So take a listen here without the compressor, and then I'll kick it in. Watch how much reduction we're doing, and watch how it moves in time with our song here. Couple things to note here, right? We're losing some low end because of how much compression we're doing. 8 dB of compression. That is one of the reasons we rolled off some of the sub area to begin with. We don't need all of that extra low end energy pushing so hard into our compressor. Because it's kick drum, our low end is where the focus is on the drum. That's where our fundamental is. That's where the bulk of the energy is. So all of that is going to be pushing harder into the compressor, and low end is going to drive compression harder than top end is usually. So if we have a bunch of low end energy, a bunch of sub energy pushing into our compression, we're not going to get the emphasis on the attack that we want. That's why we're rolling off some of it first before we do this 8.5 dB of compression. Now that amount of compression is key to getting that emphasis on the attack. So take a listen one more time without and then with. Listen, we lose some low end here, but listen to how it highlights the top end attack and the top end to click, while also tightening up our drum overall here. Take a listen. We do have a little bit of makeup gain there as well. I muted my microphone to make sure our compression is even in and out of the compressor here. Our level is even in and out of the compression here. So moving on to step 3 now is more EQ. So step 1 is EQ to get rid of what we don't need. Prime the unit here, or the track, being the kick drum, for compression. Step number 2 is compression here. So step number 1, we're getting rid of what we don't need. Step number 2, we're using our compressor to tighten up our track and to emphasize the attack on it. Okay, step number 3 is boosting generally. So using our EQ to emphasize or highlight what we like about the track. So bringing up our low end and bringing up our top end click here. We're going to start at the top end because that tends to be where I start with tracks here. There is one more cut going on here after the compression. Had a little bit too much of the click coming through in the mid-range as well as in the top end here. So we're doing a little balancing act here with our top 2 boosts here, or with our top 2 moves here. So take a listen. This is just a quick dB.5 move. It's a shelf that's at about 900 hertz. So rolling everything down here on the top end just a little bit to even out our drum here. Take a listen. You can hear when I kick this in, it balances our drum out, right? Our top end and our bottom end seem to sit evenly. That's what we want. Now we can highlight them or emphasize the areas that we want. Starting with our top end here. Now I usually like to boost somewhere around here, so 7K, 8K, or 9K, depending on the kick drum and depending on what I want. If I want more air, I'll move more towards 9 or 10K here. But if I want more emphasis on the click and the attack, I'll be here at 7K. So that's where I want, that's what I'm looking for with this kick drum. So take a listen, dB.5 boost here at 7K. You can hear it gives you exactly what you want. It's that top end click, that top end attack. It's that sort of sucky sound that you get when soccer players kicking a soccer ball, right? That's the attack element that you need to help your kick drum cut through a mix. Now, we need to balance our low end with our top end. We've emphasized our top end. Let's get our low end set where we want it. Mainly on kick drum, I'm boosting at 80 hertz here. So I'm boosting 3 dB at 80 hertz. This is that frequency that you're going to feel in your chest. It's a little bit higher than the weight, but we're going to add that in a second here. This is the fundamental frequency that's going to balance our top end and bottom end. So listen when I kick this in, how it feels like our top end and bottom end kind of click into place with each other. Things start to sit where they should, right? Now we need to add weight. So we've added that sense of bigness that hits you in your chest. Now we need to add some weight to our kick drum to help it feel powerful. That's where this last boost comes in. A dB.5 at 45 hertz. Remember I said we rolled off some of the sub area so it didn't drive our compressor too hard. We're going to add a little bit of it back here. Sometimes you don't need to. Sometimes after your compression, you have exactly what you need in your kick drum. Here we needed a little bit extra. That's why we have this last step of EQ here. So take a listen without and then with this last boost in. That's that low end weight that helps our kick drum feel powerful and help it feel massive. We get some bigness from the fundamental boost here, but that's more a balancing act to help it sit with our top end there. That's that frequency that you feel in your chest. That's that heaviness, that's that weight you need on your kick drum. Those are our 3 steps here, okay? We're gonna do it one more time with our snare drum here. But let's review here. EQ, getting rid of what we don't need. Compression, to tighten the drum, emphasize the attack. Then more EQ, either to bring up the fundamental or to bring up that crack and that air on the top end. Moving over to our snare drum here, we're going to go through the same steps one more time here, okay? So take a listen with and without the plugins here on our snare drum. You can hear without the processing here, our snare drum feels a little dull. It feels like it's a little looser than we want it to be inside the mix here. Those are the two things we're getting from our processing here, from our three-step framework. We're getting some tightness and we're getting some crack to wake up our snare drum a little bit. So let's take off all our plugins here, following the same three-step process here. And again, we are starting with a little bit of limiting here on the front end just to roll off some of those peaks and to set them in with the rest of the snare drum. You can see there's some bigger hits here that jump out a little bit. He hits the snare drum maybe a little bit harder, gets a rim shot in there. This is just tucking those kind of things into the mix so they're not jumping out and our snare drum's not all over the place. Our step one here, getting rid of what we don't need on the snare drum, is literally just a high-pass filter. Now you'll hear when I kick this in, same deal with our kick drum, right? It's going to feel like we're rolling off maybe too much of our low end. But with our snare drum, we have things like our room mics and we have reverb that we add down the road that are going to add low end back. So if you have too much low end coming from your spot mic, when you add in your room mics, when you add in reverb down the road, then your snare drum is going to feel too heavy and too muddy. So to negate that, we go a little bit too far with our high pass filter here. Take a listen. We lose a little bit of weight on our snare drum here, but you can hear that we shift the focus more towards the top end here, more towards the crack of the snare drum. That's the stuff we want to push into our compressor in step two. Step one here on our snare drum, just getting rid of what we don't need, and that's all that sub area and that heaviness in the bottom end. Moving on to step two, same exact settings here as we had on our kick drum. Well, the only thing that's different here is our threshold, but attack, release, ratio, same kind of deal here, and for the same reasons. You can see our snare drum isn't moving too fast here, and when it does, it sits right in line with our kick drum. So we can leave our release exactly where it was on our kick drum, so our compressor will move in time. And then attack, we don't want our attack to be too fast, otherwise we're going to neuter that initial spike and that initial transient on our snare drum. Then we won't have any attack and we won't have any crack to our snare drum. And ratio, we don't want to go too aggressive again because we'll neuter our snare drum. Take a listen here with our compression. Listen to what it's doing to our snare drum, okay? We'll start without it and then I'll kick it in. Notice what we're getting here from our compressor. We're getting a little bit of that low end back, some of that thickness that we cut out with our first EQ. So if we didn't do this here, we would have more low end pushing through our compressor, and again, we would end up with too much thickness there that we would have to cut out later. So taking care of that in our step one here. Step two, we are tightening our snare drum with our compressor, so you can hear it tightens up a little bit, and we emphasize that initial attack. So take a listen one more time here. And then this limiter here following our compressor, same kind of deal here. Just a touch of limiting to hold our snare drum in place. There were a couple peaks there you can see at the end and in the middle here that get a little bit crazy, just using the limiter to tuck them back into place here. So we've done our step 1, we've done our step 2. Now step 3 is our boosting and our emphasis here. There are a couple extra cuts here, same kind of deal that we had with our kick drum, right? Getting a little bit too much of something from our compressor, rolling off some of that extra thickness that we gained, and then just a touch here in the mid-range. And you'll see why here in a second when I throw that in. You'll see we have an extra bump there. But starting with the bottom end here, we're going to roll off some of that extra thickness. So when we do throw in our reverb and our overheads and our room mics down the road, our snare drum isn't too heavy sounding. So take a listen, just trimming some of that out. Not too big of a difference. We're not neutering our fundamental there, but just being safe as we add stuff down the road. Now our next cut here at the end that we're doing a little bit of shaping here is we're pulling out just a touch, a half dB at 500 hertz here. And if you watch before I throw this cut in, you'll see we have a little bump here in the mid-range, and we want to make sure our snare drum is pretty even sounding. So just dialing some of that back, just a touch here inside our mix. So listen with and without. It's a subtle move, but it's just enough to make sure there's not too much energy going on in the mid-range there. That's mainly where we want our vocal energy to be, is mid-range and top end. So we don't want too much going on from our snare drum here. Next move I'm going to make here is our boost up on the top end here. This is another subtle move, a half dB boost up at 9K. So remember when we talked about our kick drum here, we're boosting a little bit higher than 7K because we want to get more air on our snare drum. Take a listen to what this does for our snare drum. So we'll start without it, then I'm going to put this in. It's a half dB boost at 9K here. It helps to emphasize the bottom snare on the snare drum, so it brings up some of those ghosts and some of those little rolls he's doing in between the snare hits. Gives our snare some openness while emphasizing some of that crispiness that you're getting from your bottom snare. So that's a nice tasty move there. Next move we're making here is this dB boost at 4K. This is where we're going to get some crack to help our snare drum cut through the mix here. This is a smaller move too, a dB boost here, but it's going to go a long way to help our snare drum have more point to it. So take a listen to this boost here. Just giving our snare a little bit of point and a little bit of extra crack there to help when we throw everything in, to help it cut through the mix. So if we look here, we got a lot of tracks going on in this mix. We got some loop elements, we got a lot of guitars going on, some keys, and a huge stack of background vocals. So there's a lot of stuff here for our snare drum to compete with. So extra crack is going to help it be competitive inside the mix here. Last move we're making here on our snare drum, last move for step 3 in our framework, is just adding some body here. This move here, if you watch again on the frequency spectrum, you'll see there's a dip here in the mid-range. So this is making sure that we're not lacking anywhere on our snare drum. And when I throw this in, you'll actually notice it feels a little bit lower pitched than we're actually doing. It doesn't feel like a 2K boost here. It kind of feels a little bit lower because it adds some body and some fullness to our snare drum. So take a listen. That boost just helps to make sure our snare drum doesn't feel scooped. It helps it feel full-bodied and full range across the frequency spectrum there. Those are our 3 steps across our snare drum and across our kick drum. We're doing EQ, getting rid of what we don't need. So on our kick drum here, that means pulling out any kind of resonance, any kind of ringing, rolling off some of that sub area to make sure we're not pushing too hard in. And on our snare drum, that just means rolling off some of the bottom end there, just to make sure we're not getting too much bleed from our kick drum or that our snare drum isn't too thick down the road. Step number 2 is using our compressor to tighten up our elements here, to tighten up our kick and snare, and to add some extra attack. And all that means is making sure our attack is slow enough that we let that initial transient pop through, and layering on maybe more compression than we need to, right? So on our kick drum, doing about 8.5 dB of compression. On our snare drum, doing about 6 dB of compression there. Last step in our framework here, step 3 in our drum mixing framework, is our final EQ to highlight the most prominent areas or the fundamental areas of our kick and of our snare. So on our kick drum, pulling up that top end click and bringing up our low end weight and that frequency, the fundamental frequency that you're going to feel in your chest, that adds some bigness to our kick drum. And on our snare, we're pulling up that nice top end air that helps bring up our bottom snare sound, brings up some of those ghost notes you're hearing, adding that crack there at 4K, and then making sure our snare drum is full-bodied with this mid-range boost so it's not scooped sounding. Those are our 3 steps. So take a listen here. I'm going to A-B all the plugins on both our kick drum and our snare drum. We'll start with out, and then I'll kick them in. That is it there. Those are our 3 steps. That's my 3-step framework for mixing drums. That's what's going through my head. That's the process I'm following when I'm attacking kick drum, snare drum, even toms, and overheads and rooms. It's just not as extensive on some of those later tracks. We don't need all that compression and all that double EQ. Sometimes it's just step 1 of the process and your track is sitting where you want it. Now, if you do want to go a little bit deeper into this process and you want to see how to mix drums step by step, regardless of your point of origin or regardless of your initial tracks, that is why I have my new course, Mixing Live Drums from Scratch. All week here, we are launching this new course. All week until Friday, you have access to the launch week bonus. So if you join the course here during launch week, you will get access to 3 extra video modules where I walk you through my 3 strategies to level up your drum mixes. And the extra bonus for the live stream here, for the webinar, is that if you join the course using the link below the webinar here, just available today. So at the end of the day today, this link will be gone. It will be inactive. If you join using that link below the video here, you will get access to an exclusive one-time mix critique. So you can go through the course, you can go through both sections in the course here. It's made up of 2 main sections. So whether you have poorly recorded drum tracks, you're recording drum tracks in your bedroom, or you have professionally recorded drum tracks, maybe you're a professional audio engineer, both sections will apply for you. So section number 1, we go through mixing poorly recorded drum tracks. In section number 2, we go through how to mix professionally recorded drum tracks. And you'll see every move I make, and you'll get to know exactly why I'm making each move along the way. And then, like I said, if you join this week, you will get access to the 3 strategies to level up your drum mixes. So you'll see how to take your professional sounding drum mixes that much further, give them that much more punch, that much more energy. And if you join using the link below the video here, below the live stream, you will get an exclusive one-time only mix critique. So you can go through the course, get your drum mixes done, and then you can upload them and send them to me and get feedback on how you can improve or how you can better your drum skills, your drum mixing skills. Thank you guys so much for joining me here. If you aren't on my email list, you won't be getting these daily emails about the launch of the course. Make sure you're on that email list so you can get exclusive access to the launch week bonuses into the bonus here today. Thank you guys for joining me here on the live stream, on the webinar. Hope to see you in the course here during launch week.